Welcome to Quiet Theories, where we explore the stories that captivate us, presented in a way that lets your mind wander peacefully into rest. Tonight, we're diving deep into the final chapter of Stranger Things, examining every layer of Season 5, from its opening moments to its bittersweet conclusion. We'll walk through every episode, every character arc, every thematic element that made this conclusion both satisfying and thought-provoking. So settle in, get comfortable, adjust your pillows, and let the story wash over you as we unravel the mysteries of Hawkins one last time. Before we begin this journey, if you find comfort in these long-form explorations, if you appreciate having complex narratives broken down in a calm, thorough way while you drift off to sleep, consider subscribing to Quiet Theories. It's the best way to support this channel and ensure you never miss another deep dive into the stories we love. Your subscription helps us continue creating these peaceful, comprehensive explorations of the narratives that shape our culture. Now, let's return to Hawkins, Indiana for the final time. The fifth and final season of Stranger Things arrived as both a conclusion and a meditation on everything the series had built over nearly a decade of storytelling. To understand where we end, we must first understand the foundation laid in the season's early episodes, the threads woven throughout its middle chapters, and the way those threads came together in the finale that brought this story to its close. This season represented not just the end of a television show, but the conclusion of a cultural phenomenon that had defined streaming television and reshaped how we think about nostalgic storytelling in the modern era. Season 5 opened with a world fundamentally changed from where we left it. The barrier between our reality and the upside down had grown thinner, more permeable with each passing day. Hawkins itself bore the scars of previous battles, physical damage to buildings and infrastructure, but also psychological damage to the community that had endured so much supernatural trauma. The town existed in a state of uneasy normalcy, people going about their daily lives while suppressing the knowledge that their world had been invaded multiple times by forces beyond comprehension. Something new was stirring in the darkness. The opening episodes reintroduced us to characters we'd grown to love, now older, carrying the weight of everything they'd experienced. Time had passed since the events of Season 4, and that passage of time showed on everyone. Mike Wheeler, once the heart of the group's adventuring spirit, had become more contemplative, more aware of how fragile their victories had been. He carried himself differently now, with the bearing of someone who understood that happy endings weren't guaranteed, that everything they'd fought for could be taken away in an instant. 11, having spent years learning to control and understand her abilities, faced new questions about her purpose and her connection to the darker forces that had shaped her life from birth. She'd grown into her powers, learned to use them with precision rather than raw emotion, but that growth came with awareness of what those powers represented. She was a weapon, whether she wanted to be or not, and the question haunting her throughout the season was whether she could be anything else. Will Byers, whose disappearance had started everything back in that first season, carried a connection to the Upside Down that never truly severed. His sensitivity to the otherworldly realm made him both vulnerable and invaluable. Throughout the early episodes, we saw him struggling with that connection, feeling the pull of something vast and unknowable stirring in the shadows. He'd touch the back of his neck unconsciously, that old habit from earlier seasons, sensing disturbances in the dimensional fabric that others couldn't perceive. Lucas and Max navigated their relationship while Max continued recovering from her encounter with Vecna. Her consciousness had been fractured by that experience, her clinical death and supernatural resurrection leaving her changed in ways both visible and hidden. She saw the world differently now, with a darkness at the edges of her vision that never quite disappeared. Sometimes she'd stare at nothing, seeing things in that peripheral darkness that she couldn't quite articulate to others. Lucas stayed constant through all of this, his patience and loyalty offering Max an anchor when she felt herself drifting toward places she couldn't articulate or fully understand. Dustin brought his characteristic enthusiasm, though now tempered with a deeper understanding of the stakes they faced. He'd lost Eddie Munson, his friend and mentor in all things related to metal music and Dungeons and Dragons, and that loss had matured him in ways that showed in quiet moments. He wore Eddie's Hellfire Club shirt, like armour, a talisman connecting him to someone who'd shown him that being yourself, even when society judged you for it, was the bravest thing you could do. The older characters too had evolved. In the years since we first met them, Steve Harrington, once defined by his hair and his popularity at Hawkins High, had become a protector, someone who'd found purpose in keeping the kids safe. His journey from shallow teenager to surrogate older brother to the group represented one of the show's most successful character arcs, and Season 5 built on that foundation. Steve had given up on certain dreams, the college scholarship, the conventional path to success, but he'd found something more meaningful in the process. Nancy Wheeler pursued truth with journalistic fervour, determined to document and understand the forces that had invaded her town. She'd always been driven, always been the one who refused to accept easy answers or convenient lies, and now she channeled that quality into investigative journalism. She carried notebooks everywhere, documenting strange occurrences, interviewing witnesses, building a comprehensive record of everything Hawkins had endured. Part of her motivation was practical, creating evidence that couldn't be denied or dismissed, but part of it was personal, a need to impose order and understanding on chaos that had taken so much from her community. Jonathan processed everything through his artistic lens, finding meaning in the visual representation of their struggle. His photography had always been his way of engaging with the world, capturing moments that revealed deeper truths than surface appearances suggested. Now he documented the aftermath of supernatural invasion, the ways a community tried to rebuild while carrying trauma that couldn't be photographed or captured, but showed in people's eyes, in the way they moved through spaces that had once felt safe. Joyce and Hopper, having finally found each other after years of missed chances and near misses, now faced the possibility that their hard-won happiness might be temporary. They'd both lost so much, endured so much, that their relationship carried the weight of all that accumulated pain. But it also carried hope, the possibility that even people as damaged as them could find connection and peace. Their scenes together in the early episodes showed two people learning to be happy while still waiting for the other shoe to drop, unable to fully trust that they'd earned this respite from suffering. The season's structure revealed itself gradually, a deliberate choice by the Duffer brothers that would prove controversial among fans and critics. They divided the final season into 3 volumes, creating breathing room between major revelations while also building anticipation for what came next. Volume 1 established the threat, showing us the signs that something terrible was building in the shadows. Volume 2 developed the plan, the strategies, and preparations the group would need to confront the evil they'd been fighting for years. And Volume 3 delivered the confrontation that would determine everything, the final battle that would either save their world or doom it to consumption by forces beyond human understanding. In those early episodes of Volume 1, we learned that Vecna's defeat at the end of Season 4 had been incomplete. Henry Creel, the boy who became the monster, had not been destroyed, but rather retreated, healing, planning, gathering strength for one final assault on the boundary between worlds. His ultimate goal became clear through visions and fragments of information pieced together by the group, like assembling a puzzle where each piece revealed something more disturbing than the last. He didn't simply want to merge the Upside Down with our reality, though that would have been catastrophic enough. He wanted to open a pathway to something deeper, something older, something that made the Upside Down look like a waiting room for true cosmic horror. Dimension X, the source realm from which the Mind Flayer originated, the abyss that had corrupted him as a child and set him on the path to becoming Vecna. Opening that gateway would bring something into our world that human minds weren't equipped to comprehend, let alone resist. The stage play The First Shadow, which some dedicated fans had seen performed in London and New York, provided crucial backstory that enriched the season's narrative. For those who hadn't seen the play, the season included flashbacks and exposition that filled in the gaps, though knowing the play's full story added layers of meaning to certain scenes and character choices. The play explored Henry's childhood in detail, showing us the lonely, sensitive boy before the monster, the moment he encountered the Mind Flayer, the ways his father's experiments with dimensional rifts had exposed him to forces beyond human comprehension. Dr. Brenner, whose shadow hung over the Entire series, even after his death, had worked with Henry's father on those early experiments. They'd been trying to harness dimensional energy to create weapons that would give America an insurmountable advantage in the Cold War. The hubris of thinking they could control forces they didn't understand led directly to Henry's corruption and everything that followed. In trying to create a weapon, they'd opened a door that could never be fully closed, and that door had allowed something ancient and evil to reach through and claim a vulnerable child. The play revealed that Henry had been a victim before becoming a villain, a lonely, vulnerable child who found comfort in darkness because darkness promised him power and understanding that the human world denied him. He'd been different from other children, sensitive to things they couldn't perceive, aware of cruelties and hypocrisies that others his age didn't notice or didn't care about. That difference isolated him, made him feel fundamentally disconnected from humanity, and when the Mind Flayer reached out to him, it offered something he'd never experienced: acceptance, purpose, belonging. This context reframed much of what we understood about Vecna. He wasn't simply evil incarnate, though his actions were monstrous. He was a cautionary tale about isolation, about what happens when someone with extraordinary abilities finds no anchor in human connection, no reason to resist the seductive whispers of cosmic malevolence. The Mind Flayer had seen in young Henry Creel a perfect vessel, someone whose pain and alienation made him receptive to promises of power and purpose. As the season progressed through those early episodes, we learned more about the nature of the Upside Down itself. Eleven's creation of this mirror realm during her first confrontation with Henry had been previously established in Season 4, but Season 5 revealed additional layers to that creation. The Upside Down wasn't simply a copy of Hawkins frozen in time. It was something more complex, something with its own terrible logic. The Upside Down existed as a bridge, a dimensional membrane between our world and Dimension X. Think of it as a buffer zone, a space where the laws of physics from both realms mixed and produced something that shouldn't exist, but did. Vecna had been working for years to widen that bridge, to create a permanent gateway through which the Mind Flayer could fully manifest in our reality. Every gate he'd opened, every person he'd killed to fuel his power, every corruption he'd spread through Hawkins, all of it was preparation for this final plan. The Mind Flayer itself represented something beyond individual consciousness or intention. It was cosmic horror in its purest form, an entity of shadow and hunger that existed before human civilization, perhaps before Earth itself. Its motivations were incomprehensible, not because they were complex, but because they were fundamentally alien. It consumed. It expanded. It converted everything it touched into extensions of its will. There was no negotiating with it, no reasoning with it, no possibility of coexistence. It was antithetical to life as we understood it. Henry Creel had become its prophet, its general, its willing servant, who believed he was a partner in the coming transformation. But the season raised questions about how much agency Henry truly retained. Was he making choices, or was he a puppet convinced of his own autonomy? The show played with this ambiguity, sometimes showing Henry as a victim still, other times showing him as a willing participant in evil who'd stopped fighting his corruption because resistance seemed futile or undesirable. Throughout Volume 1, the season established multiple plot threads that would weave together in later episodes. Holly Wheeler's story became increasingly important, transforming the youngest Wheeler child from the background presence to active participant in the supernatural drama. Oh, by Chish. Innocence made her vulnerable in ways the battle-hardened older kids were not. She saw the world with uncomplicated clarity, believing in simple categories of good and evil that the others had learned to question. Vecna captured her during a quiet moment, pulling her into the Upside Down through a vision that started as a dream. One moment she was sleeping in her bed, the next she was awakening in his castle, a structure that evoked the Dark Crystal's nightmare architecture. The Dark Crystal connection wasn't accidental. A poster for that film had appeared in the Wheeler basement in Season 1. Mike and the boys playing D&D beneath Jim Henson's dark fantasy imagery, and now the visual echoes came full circle, suggesting that the Duffer Brothers had been planning these aesthetic callbacks from the very beginning. Holly's time in Vecna's castle revealed aspects of his psychology and his plan that the others couldn't have discovered any other way. He saw in her a kind of purity that reminded him of what he'd lost, the innocence that had been stolen from him when the mind flayer infected him in those Nevada caves. But he also saw an opportunity. If he could corrupt someone so innocent, if he could turn her into a disciple, it would prove something to himself about the inevitability of darkness, about his choice to embrace the mind flayer having been not just understandable, but correct. But Holly resisted in ways that surprised him. Her escape attempts, though ultimately unsuccessful in getting her out of the castle, showed a resilience that spoke to the strength running through the entire Wheeler family. Nancy's determination, Mike's loyalty, their mother's fierce protectiveness, all of that lived in Holly too, and Vecna hadn't accounted for it. He'd assumed a child would be easy to break, but Holly fought back with everything she had. The military subplot involving Dr. Kane and her forces added another dimension to the conflict, complicating the straightforward narrative of good versus evil that might otherwise have defined the season. The government had never stopped trying to understand and weaponize the phenomena surrounding Hawkins. They'd suffered setbacks, lost facilities and personnel, but the institutional drive to turn supernatural power into military advantage never wavered. Dr. Kane represented a particular kind of pragmatic evil, someone who viewed Eleven and the other psychic children as tools rather than people. She probably didn't think of herself as evil. In her mind, she was serving her country, protecting national security, doing difficult but necessary work. That made her more dangerous in some ways than Vecna, because her evil was banal, bureaucratic, the kind that justifies atrocities through appeals to necessity and patriotism. Her efforts to capture Eleven and bring her under military control created tension that complicated the group's plans to confront Vecna. They had to fight on multiple fronts against supernatural evil and human institutional power, and those fights required different strategies and different sacrifices. You couldn't use psychic abilities to defeat military bureaucracy, and you couldn't fill out the right paperwork to stop an interdimensional monster. Kane's forces included specialized units trained in interdimensional combat, soldiers equipped with technology reverse-engineered from captured upside-down creatures. The government had been studying the specimens and technology left behind from previous incursions, learning from each encounter, building capabilities that made them formidable opponents. Among these units was Acri's Wolfpack, an elite team that stalked 11 throughout the season, always a few steps behind, but steadily closing the distance. The cat-and-mouse game between 11 and these hunters created suspense independent of the supernatural threat. A reminder that human antagonism could be just as dangerous as demonic entities. Acri himself was a true believer, someone who saw 11 as a threat to national security that needed to be contained. He wasn't wrong that her powers were dangerous, but his inability to see her as a person, as someone deserving of agency and freedom, blinded him to the possibility that she was their best hope against forces that would destroy everything the military claimed to be protecting. This is where we should pause and reflect on the layered nature of the threats facing our protagonists. They weren't simply fighting monsters from another dimension. They were fighting government institutions that wanted to control them, societal forces that didn't believe their warnings about supernatural threats, and the fundamental difficulty of maintaining human connections under extraordinary pressure. The real tragedy of Stranger Things has always been watching childhood end, watching innocence confronted with horrors that force premature maturity. The season explored this theme through multiple character arcs, showing us how each person grappled with the impossibility of returning to who they'd been before the Upside Down invaded their lives. Mike and Eleven's relationship faced new strains as they tried to build something resembling a normal teenage romance while knowing that normalcy might be an illusion they couldn't afford. They loved each other, that was never in question. But love alone couldn't bridge the gap between Eleven's sense of responsibility towards stopping Vecna and Mike's desire to protect her from having to sacrifice everything. Their conversations throughout the season circled around questions of duty and choice, destiny and free will. Eleven insisted that her powers made her responsible for confronting threats no one else could handle. She'd been created to be a weapon, moulded by Brenner's experiments, and while she hated what had been done to her, she couldn't ignore the reality that her abilities gave her responsibilities. Others didn't have. Mike argued that she'd already given enough, that she deserved a normal life, that someone else could take up the burden. But who? That was the question neither of them could answer satisfactorily. There were other children with powers, other potential heroes, but none with Eleven's specific combination of strength and training and experience. She was uniquely positioned to fight Vecna, and they both knew it even if Mike didn't want to accept it. His optimism, his belief in happy endings, clashed with Eleven's pragmatic understanding that some fights required sacrifices, and sometimes the person making the sacrifice didn't get to have the happy ending they deserved. Will's journey towards self-acceptance provided one of the season's emotional cores, a storyline that had been building subtly across multiple seasons and now reached its culmination. His sexuality, handled with increasing directness in Season 4, became explicit in Season 5. The show portrayed his coming out not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet acknowledgement of something everyone who loved him already understood or suspected. Mike's response, when Will finally spoke the words aloud, was simple acceptance. They were best friends. That wouldn't change. Will being gay didn't alter the foundation of their friendship, didn't change the shared history of campaigns and adventures and life or death situations that they'd faced together. If anything, Mike felt relief that Will had trusted him enough to be honest, had felt safe enough in their friendship to be vulnerable about something so personal. The show's handling of this storyline felt earned, the culmination of subtle character work across multiple seasons. Will had always been sensitive, different in ways that made him a target for bullies, even before his disappearance into the Upside Down. His artistic nature, his emotional intelligence, his discomfort with typical masculine aggression. All of it had been there from the beginning for viewers who were paying attention. The revelation wasn't a surprise so much as a confirmation, and the show treated it with the matter-of-fact acceptance that healthy friendships should offer. Dustin's arc involved grief and continuity, processing the loss of Eddie Munson while honouring his memory through action rather than just mourning. Eddie's death in Season 4 had left Dustin carrying survivors, guilt, questioning why he'd lived when someone braver and more talented had died protecting him. He wore the Hellfire Club shirt throughout the final season, a talisman connecting him to the moment when he'd found belonging in the chaos of Hawkins High School's Dungeons and Dragons Club. But Dustin didn't just wear the shirt. He embodied Eddie's philosophy, his refusal to let other people's judgments define him, his commitment to the things he loved, even when society deemed them childish or weird. Dustin's tribute to Eddie in the season's closing moments would provide one of its most emotionally resonant scenes, a speech that captured everything Eddie had meant to him and to the culture of Hawkins High School that had too often rejected difference and individuality. Lucas and Max's relationship showed two people trying to find their way back to each other after trauma had nearly destroyed Max entirely. Her time in Vecna's thrall, her clinical death and supernatural resurrection had left her changed in fundamental ways. She saw the world differently now, with the darkness at the edges of her vision that never quite disappeared. Sometimes she'd stare at nothing, seeing things in that peripheral darkness that she couldn't quite articulate to others, shapes and suggestions of movement, that might be after effects of her ordeal or might be something more sinister. Lucas stayed constant through all of this, his patience and loyalty offering Max an anchor when she felt herself drifting toward places she couldn't articulate or fully understand. He didn't try to fix her or minimize what she'd been through. He just stayed present, showing up day after day, offering friendship and love without demanding anything in return. It was the kind of quiet heroism the show had always celebrated, the courage to keep showing up for people you care about, even when you can't solve their problems. Their relationship also grappled with survivor's guilt and the arbitrary nature of who lives and who dies in traumatic situations. Max had died, technically, her heart stopping for over a minute before 11 pulled her back. Billy had died saving her in Season 3. The randomness of survival, the way some people walked away from terrible things while others didn't, haunted Max in quiet moments. Lucas couldn't give her answers about why she'd survived when others hadn't, but he could remind her that survival wasn't something to feel guilty about. Steve's transformation from Season 1's shallow, popular kid to the group's protective, older brother figure found its culmination in Season 5. The season toyed with the possibility of his death, foreshadowing moments where he seemed marked for tragedy. Images of him surrounded by darkness, close calls during dangerous situations, conversations that felt like farewells. All of it suggested Steve might not survive to the end, but ultimately, Steve survived, and more importantly, found purpose beyond simple survival. His decision to become a teacher, revealed in the flash-forward epilogue, showed someone who'd learned that protecting people could take forms beyond physical combat. He could shape young minds, could help kids navigate the challenges of growing up, could be the mentor to others that various people had been to him across the series. It was a fitting conclusion for someone whose entire arc had been about discovering that there was more to life than being popular or cool. Nancy's investigation into the truth behind Hawkins' curse drove much of the season's expository work. She interviewed witnesses, dug through archives, connected dots that official channels refused to acknowledge. Her journalistic instincts served the group well, providing concrete evidence they could use to anticipate Vecna's moves. She'd learned from her experiences with the Hawkins post and the sexist dismissal she'd faced there, developed sources throughout the community who trusted her to tell their stories accurately. But Nancy also struggled with personal choices, particularly regarding Jonathan and Steve. Both men cared for her deeply. Both had been important in her life, had helped shape who she'd become. But Nancy's focus remained on the work, on the mission. Romance could wait until after they'd saved the world, and maybe afterward she'd discover that neither relationship was what she needed. The season left her romantic future ambiguous, suggesting that Nancy's primary relationship was with her work, her calling to expose truth and fight injustice. Jonathan and Steve's friendship, developed over previous seasons through shared experiences and mutual respect, deepened in season 5. They had an honest conversation about Nancy, acknowledging their shared feelings while also recognizing that Nancy's agency mattered more than their competition. Their decision to step back, to let Nancy make her own choices without pressure, showed maturity that would have been unthinkable in earlier seasons. It also cleared emotional space for both of them to focus on the immediate crisis. Steve could channel his protective instincts toward the whole group rather than fixating on Nancy specifically. Jonathan could process his complicated feelings about his future, his artistic ambitions, his family responsibilities, without the added pressure of competing for Nancy's affection. Their friendship became deeper through that mutual stepping back, built on respect rather than rivalry. Joyce and Hopper's relationship provided the adult emotional centre of the season. They'd been through hell separately and together. They'd lost children, made impossible sacrifices, survived things that should have killed them. Joyce had endured Bob's death, had fought to keep her family together through poverty and supernatural invasion. Hopper had lost his daughter Sarah to cancer, had been captured and tortured in a Russian prison, had fought his way back to life when everyone thought he was dead. Now, finally, together in a way that felt real and permanent, they faced the possibility that everything could still be taken away. Their scenes together balanced lightness and weight, showing two people who understood each other's damage and loved each other. Not despite it, but because they recognized themselves in each other's scars. They'd both built walls around their hearts, convinced they didn't deserve happiness, or that happiness was too fragile to trust, and slowly they dismantled those walls together. Their relationship also provided perspective on what the kids were fighting for. Mike and Eleven's young love was beautiful and intense, but Joyce and Hopper showed what love looked like after years of life and loss. After learning that commitment means choosing someone every day, even when it's hard. Their engagement, proposed in the flash-forward epilogue, represented hope that even people as damaged as them could build something lasting. The season's second volume shifted focus from establishing threats to preparation and strategy. The group couldn't simply charge at Vecna with determination and hope for the best. They needed a plan, a comprehensive strategy that accounted for everything they knew about the Upside Down, Vecna's abilities, the Mind Flayer's nature, and the limitations of their own powers and resources. Planning sessions filled multiple episodes. The group gathered around tables covered in maps and notes, arguing about tactics and acceptable risks. Dustin's revelation about the Upside Down functioning as a bridge to Dimension X proved crucial to developing their strategy. If they could sever that bridge, they could isolate Vecna, cut him off from the Mind Flayer's power source, potentially weaken him enough to defeat. The Mind Flayer's full power was in Dimension X, and what they'd been fighting in previous seasons was just a fraction of its strength reaching through the dimensional barrier. Cut off from that source, Vecna would still be formidable, but beatable. But severing the bridge meant entering the Upside Down in force, penetrating deep into Vecna's territory, reaching the castle he'd constructed as both fortress and body for the Mind Flayer's manifestation. The logistics of this mission occupied much of Volume 2. The practical details of how they could accomplish something so dangerous and complex. They needed equipment they didn't have, coordination they hadn't practiced, multiple teams operating in sync across different dimensions. The radio tower became central to their plan, a physical point of intersection between worlds that they could use to breach the barrier. Radio towers had appeared throughout the series as locations where the membrane between dimensions grew thin, where signals could cross from one reality to another. Now they would use that weakness deliberately, opening a controlled breach large enough to send teams through but small enough that they could seal it afterward, trapping themselves in the Upside Down, if necessary, to prevent contamination of their world. The plan's complexity reflected the show's evolution from simple kids-on-bikes adventure to coordinated military-style operations involving dimensional physics and psychic warfare. Early seasons featured kids with walkie-talkies and baseball bats. Now we had detailed tactical planning, fallback positions, contingency plans for contingency plans. But beneath the increased scale, the emotional core remained the same. These were people who cared about each other, fighting to protect their home and preserve the possibility of normal lives. Volume 2 also developed the season's themes around sacrifice and choice, forcing multiple characters to confront what they were willing to give up to achieve victory. Eleven's awareness that defeating Vecna might require her own life hung over every scene she appeared in. She didn't speak this fear aloud often, but it coloured her interactions, particularly with Hopper and Mike. She looked at them sometimes with an intensity that suggested she was memorising details, storing memories against a future where she might not be present to create new ones. The father-daughter relationship between Eleven and Hopper faced its ultimate test in these middle episodes. Hopper had already lost one daughter to illness, watching Sarah waste away in a hospital bed while feeling utterly powerless to save her. The prospect of losing Eleven to heroic sacrifice was almost more than he could bear. At least Sarah's death hadn't been a choice. She'd fought to live and lost, but if Eleven chose to sacrifice herself, chose to leave him, that would be different and somehow worse. Their conversations about duty and family provided some of the season's most emotionally complex moments. Eleven insisted she wasn't Sarah. Wasn't Hopper's biological daughter, who'd had no choice in her fate. 11 had powers. 11 had agency. If she chose to make a sacrifice, that choice meant something, different than Sarah's tragic death from illness. It was an assertion of will, a decision to use her abilities for something meaningful, and Hopper had to respect that, even if he hated it. Hopper struggled to accept this distinction. He wanted to protect 11 the way he'd failed to protect Sarah. But 11 was right. She wasn't a child anymore, wasn't someone who needed protection from choices and consequences. She'd been making life and death decisions since she was young, had more experience with impossible situations than most people accumulated in entire lifetimes. Treating her like a child now denied her the respect she'd earned through everything she'd survived. This dynamic extended to the broader group dynamics as well. The older teens and young adults had to accept that the younger kids weren't children anymore either. Dustin, Lucas, Will, Max, even Holly in her own way, they'd all proven their courage and capability. Overprotectiveness could be as dangerous as recklessness when it prevented people from contributing in ways they were uniquely qualified to help. Trust meant allowing people to take risks when those risks were calculated and necessary. The introduction of Callie, the other psychic child with powers similar to 11's, added complexity to the character dynamics and thematic exploration. Callie represented a darker possible future for 11, someone whose abilities had been weaponized more completely by Dr. Kane and the military apparatus, whose view of humanity had been shaped by being treated as a tool rather than a person. The Duffer Brothers explicitly framed Callie as a pessimistic vision of Eleven's potential trajectory, a warning about what happens when gifted children are given no anchor in normal human experience. Callie's powers focused on illusion and vision manipulation, creating sensory experiences that were indistinguishable from reality. Where Eleven could move objects telekinetically and fight physically, Callie could make you see things that weren't there, hide things that were, create entire false realities inside someone's mind. This made her both valuable ally and potential threat. Could the group trust her? Did her traumatic background make her unreliable? Would she ultimately choose to help them or betray them? These questions lingered throughout Volume 2. The Hindu goddess Kali, destroyer and transformer, provided thematic resonance for the character's name and nature. Kali in mythology embodies necessary destruction, the clearing away of old forms to make space for new growth, the recognition that creation and destruction are linked in endless cycles. Callie in Stranger Things represented similar duality. Her powers could destroy through deception, making people believe lies that would get them killed, but they could also protect through concealment, hiding the vulnerable from predators. The question was whether she would choose creation or destruction, hope or nihilism, connection or isolation. Her arc paralleled. Eleven's in many ways, both children experimented on by Brenner's programs, both given powers they didn't ask for, both forced to grow up in institutional settings that denied their humanity. But where Eleven had found connection with Hopper and the Hawkins group, Callie had remained isolated, trusting no one, convinced that attachment was weakness and everyone would ultimately betray her. Mike's optimism stood in direct opposition to Callie's pessimism, creating an ideological conflict that played out across the season. Where Callie saw inevitable darkness and betrayal, Mike insisted on the possibility of happy endings. He believed in the power of friendship, the strength that came from people supporting each other, the way love could overcome obstacles that seemed impossible. Callie dismissed this as naive fantasy, the kind of thinking that got people killed. This ideological conflict played out in arguments and quiet moments throughout Volume 2, with characters forced to choose which vision they believed in. Would friendship and love prove strong enough to overcome cosmic evil? Or were they fighting a battle already lost, merely delaying the inevitable consumption of their world by forces beyond comprehension? The season refused to definitively answer until the very end, letting the tension between hope and despair drive character choices and plot development. The stage was set for the final confrontation as Volume 2 concluded, and Volume 3 began with teams moving into position for the assault on Vecna's castle. The plan required coordination across multiple fronts, each team responsible for specific objectives that would theoretically work together to create an opportunity for victory. Eleven's team would enter the Upside Down through the radio tower breach, penetrate to Vecna's castle, and confront him directly, drawing his attention and forcing him to focus his power on defending himself rather than maintaining the dimensional bridge. Mike's team would provide support and backup, ready to exploit any opportunity that arose during the main assault. They carried equipment designed to disrupt Vecna's psychic abilities, weapons reverse-engineered from upside-down technology, and the knowledge that they might be called upon to do anything from rescue operations to final stands. Their role was flexible by necessity, responding to whatever situations developed during the chaos of battle. The military forces under Dr. Kane moved independently, pursuing their own objectives that sometimes aligned with and sometimes opposed the kids' goals. Kane wanted to capture Eleven and study her abilities, wanted specimens from the Upside Down for weapons development, wanted to demonstrate that supernatural threats could be controlled through superior technology and tactics. Her goals didn't require Vecna's defeat so much as his containment, which put her forces at cross purposes with the kids who understood that containment wasn't enough. Hopper and Joyce led a third element, experienced adults, who'd learned hard lessons about survival in hostile dimensions. Hopper's military training combined with his experience surviving the Russian prison made him invaluable for tactical planning and crisis response. Joyce's fierce maternal instincts and experience navigating bureaucratic systems to protect her children gave her insights the others lacked. Together they represented adult competence and care, the promise that the kids weren't alone in this fight. Murray provided technical expertise and comic relief, his cynical pragmatism balancing the kids' idealism. He understood systems and how to exploit them, had connections throughout various agencies and organizations, brought skills from his journalist days that proved surprisingly useful. His character reminded viewers that adults could contribute meaningfully. That experience and cynicism had value alongside youthful courage and optimism. Each element of the plan carried risks that were discussed extensively in the planning sessions. Communication between dimensions remained unreliable, dependent on equipment that might fail at crucial moments. Timing had to be precise, with teams coordinating actions across dimensional barriers based on signals that might not transmit properly. And they were facing an enemy who'd had years to prepare, who knew they were coming, who'd built his entire fortress to repel exactly this kind of assault. The descent into the Upside Down provided visual spectacle and atmospheric dread, the show's production values fully displayed in creating a world that felt genuinely alien and hostile. The mirror version of Hawkins spread before them, frozen in decay, overgrown with the organic mechanical corruption that characterized the dimension's aesthetic. Everything felt wrong in subtle ways that accumulated into profound wrongness. Distances didn't match what they should be. Sounds echoed strangely, arriving delayed or from the wrong directions. The air itself seemed thick, resistant, like moving through water that was somehow also dust. Vecna's castle loomed in the distance, a structure that defied conventional architecture and seemed to exist in more dimensions than the three they were accustomed to perceiving. It was the dark crystal's twisted spires merged with biological horror. Walls that breathed with subtle movements, towers that pulsed with malevolent life as though the building itself was a living organism. As they approached, the castle's true nature revealed itself gradually, each step forward providing new details that added to the mounting dread. It wasn't just Vecna's home, it was the Mind Flayer's body, a physical manifestation of the cosmic entity's presence in this realm, the closest thing to incarnation that something so vast and alien could achieve. Approaching it meant walking into the mouth of something vast and hungry, something that had been waiting for them with the patience of entities that experienced time differently than humans. The castle wanted them to enter, was drawing them in, and they had no choice but to accept the invitation and hope their plan would be enough. The journey to the castle tested every member of the team in ways both physical and psychological. They encountered creatures spawned from the Upside Down's corruption, demogorgons that moved with terrifying speed, demobats that swarmed in numbers that blocked out the minimal light, and things without names that defied description, creatures that shouldn't exist but did, existing in violation of natural laws that the Upside Down ignored. Combat became necessary, unavoidable encounters that drained resources and energy they'd need for the final confrontation. Every bullet spent, every burst of psychic power, every injury sustained, all of it reduced their capacity to face Vecna when they finally reached him. Steve saved Jonathan during one of these encounters, throwing himself between his friend and a demogorgon's claws, taking injuries that could have been fatal but weren't, surviving through luck and Nancy's quick thinking with emergency medical supplies. That moment solidified their friendship and allowed both to move past their complicated history with Nancy. They'd both wanted her, both believed they could make her happy, but in that moment of Steve risking his life for Jonathan, romantic competition became irrelevant. They were brothers in arms, people who'd fought side by side against impossible odds, and that bond transcended romantic rivalry. Inside Vecna's castle, the architecture defied logic and physics in ways that made navigation almost impossible. Rooms connected in impossible configurations, spaces that seemed small from outside but vast within, corridors that looped back on themselves or led to locations that shouldn't be reachable through the paths they'd taken. Gravity behaved inconsistently, pulling in different directions in different rooms, sometimes shifting mid-step and sending people tumbling toward what had been a wall but was now the floor. The laws of reality bent around the Mind Flayer's influence, creating spaces where nightmares leaked, into the physical world and became indistinguishable from material reality. You couldn't trust your senses in the castle because your senses reported impossible things that nonetheless actually existed. Holly appeared in these halls, sometimes helping by pointing toward paths that would lead them deeper, sometimes seeming to hinder by drawing them into dead ends or trap-filled chambers. Her role remained ambiguous, a source of tension. Was she under Vecna's control, forced to betray them against her will? Was she playing a deeper game, pretending to serve Vecna while actually working against him, operating as a double agent, too young to understand the concept, but intuiting the strategy? The uncertainty added tension to every encounter with her. They wanted to trust her, wanted to believe the youngest Wheeler retained her autonomy and goodness, but they couldn't be certain. Vecna's 12 disciples, the psychic children he'd corrupted or created, waited throughout the castle like pieces on a chessboard. They didn't all fight the heroes directly. Some simply watched, bearing witness to the confrontation with expressions that were difficult to read. Were they rooting for Vecna or for the heroes? Did they hate what they'd become or embrace it? Their presence evoked the Last Supper, with Vecna as a twisted messiah preparing for his moment of transformation, the culmination of years of planning and sacrifice. Holly, positioned as Judas in this perverse recreation of Christian imagery, would ultimately choose betrayal, but not the betrayal Vecna expected. He anticipated that she might turn on the heroes, might give in to fear or corruption and help him defeat them. Instead, she betrayed him, choosing her family and humanity over the power and belonging he offered. That choice, made by the youngest and most vulnerable member of the group, embodied the season's central theme about love and connection defeating cosmic evil. The team split further as they penetrated deeper into the castle, separated by the architecture's impossible geometry and by tactical necessity. 11 moved toward the throne room where Vecna waited, her psychic senses guiding her through corridors that shifted and changed, following the pull of his malevolent presence. Others moved to structural weak points identified in their planning, places where they could plant explosives or disrupt the castle's integrity and hopefully weaken the Mind Flayer's grip on this realm. The separation meant characters faced their fears individually, their personal demons given form by the castle's psychic architecture and Vecna's intimate knowledge of their vulnerabilities. Max found herself in visions of the cemetery where Billy was buried, forced to confront her complicated grief over her stepbrother's death. She'd hated Billy for years, resented him for his cruelty and the way he'd made their family situation even worse than it already was. But she'd also loved him in the complicated way siblings love each other despite everything, and his sacrifice in Season 3 had left her with unresolved feelings she'd never processed properly. Lucas stayed with her through the vision, an anchor pulling her back from the abyss of memory and guilt. He couldn't enter the vision, couldn't see what she was seeing, but he held her hand and talked to her, reminding her of where she really was and who she really was, preventing Vecna from trapping her completely in the nightmare of her own psyche. His presence made the difference between Max escaping the vision and Max being consumed by it. Will felt the Mind Flayer's presence more strongly in the castle than anywhere else, the connection that had never fully severed now screaming in his consciousness like feedback from speakers turned up too loud. He could feel the entity's vastness, its hunger, its complete alien indifference to human concepts of good and evil. It didn't hate them, it barely noticed them as individuals. They were obstacles or food, and the distinction didn't matter much. He had to push through that invasive presence, maintain his sense of self against something that wanted to dissolve his identity into its vast collective hunger. The Mind Flayer had touched him before, infected him in Season 2, and it remembered him. It wanted him back, wanted to consume the connection they'd shared, and use it to understand humanity better, to infiltrate human consciousness more completely. Will's resistance required constant effort, exhausting mental energy he needed for other things. Mike and Eleven's separation created vulnerability for both of them that they felt acutely, even while knowing it was necessary. Mike's primary strength had always been emotional rather than physical. He couldn't move objects with his mind or shoot lasers from his hands. He could love people fiercely, believe in them unwaveringly, refused to give up hope even when situations seemed hopeless. His love for Eleven, his unwavering belief in her goodness, despite everything she'd been forced to do, that had anchored her across seasons when she might otherwise have lost herself. Now, moving toward confrontation without that immediate emotional support, Eleven faced the possibility that she might lose herself in the violence required to stop Vecna. She'd killed before, many times, in self-defense and defense of others. But this would be different. This would be deliberate, planned, the goal from the beginning. She was going into Vecna's throne room with the specific intention of killing him, and that felt different from fighting for survival in the moment. The revelation of Henry Creel's full backstory came through memory visions as Eleven penetrated his mental defences, seeing fragments of his past that he'd kept hidden even from himself. We saw young Henry in the Nevada desert, drawn to the caves where a scientist had fled with stolen equipment from Brenner's early experiments. This scientist, mortally wounded by pursuing forces, had opened a breach to Dimension X using the stolen technology, not understanding what he was unleashing. The briefcase he carried contained the core memory, the essential piece of technology that could stabilize and control dimensional rifts, allowing controlled access to other realms. But dying from a gunshot wound inflicted by his pursuers, his control of the equipment failed at the crucial moment. The briefcase opened prematurely, and black particles of the Mind Flayer escaped into our reality, seeking a host, something living they could infect and use. Young Henry, wearing his scout uniform with the number 11 prominently visible on the sleeve, was infected through the bullet wound the scientist had sustained, the Mind Flayer particles entering through broken skin and spreading through his bloodstream. The Mind Flayer recognized in Henry what it needed, a human consciousness that could navigate and manipulate Earth's reality while serving as anchor for the Mind Flayer's incomprehensible alien intelligence to manifest in this dimension. The infection transformed Henry, but not instantly. The Mind Flayer worked gradually, whispering in his mind over months and years, showing him visions of power and purpose, exploiting his loneliness and alienation. It found every wound in Henry's psyche and pressed on them, made them hurt worse, used his pain as leverage to gain control. When Henry killed his family, was it his choice or the Mind Flayer's influence directing his actions? The show left this ambiguous, suggesting that the distinction might not matter. Choice and compulsion blurred in the relationship between Henry and the cosmic entity wearing his body as a suit. This backstory reframed everything viewers thought they understood about Vecna. He wasn't simply evil incarnate, though his actions were monstrous and inexcusable. He was a victim who'd stopped fighting his victimization, who'd embraced the darkness because resistance seemed futile and acceptance offered power. The show drew parallels to Christ's temptation in the desert, the 40 days Jesus spent being tested by Satan, offered kingdoms and power in exchange for worship and submission. But where Jesus rejected Satan's offers, choosing suffering and sacrifice over compromise with evil, Henry accepted the Mind Flayer's promises. He chose power over goodness, isolation over connection, darkness over light. This made him an antichrist figure, a messiah of darkness spreading corruption rather than salvation, offering damnation as though it were deliverance. The religious imagery extended throughout the final confrontation, layers of Christian symbolism inverted and twisted. Vecna appeared in crucifixion poses at key moments throughout his castle, arms spread wide, body suspended between floor and ceiling in mockery of Christian iconography. The 12 disciples echoed the apostles who followed Jesus, but where the apostles spread good news and healing, Vecna's disciples spread corruption and death. The Last Supper recreation before the final battle made the parallel explicit. Vecna seated at the head of a long table with the 12 children arranged along its sides, all of them eating food that looked normal but tasted like ash and decay. But Stranger Things used these images to explore darkness rather than light, asking what happens when messianic power serves cosmic evil rather than divine good, when someone with the capability to transform the world chooses destruction over creation. Eleven's confrontation with Vecna became the season's emotional and thematic climax, everything the show had been building toward across 5 seasons. Their psychic battle played out across multiple levels of reality simultaneously, in the physical space of the throne room where their bodies stood frozen while their minds fought, in the mental landscape of their connected consciousness where thoughts became weapons in memory and vision and nightmare given tangible form by their clashing powers. Vecna tried to break 11 by showing her what she'd become over the years, since Brenner first put her in the tank and taught her to kill, a weapon used by people who claimed to care about her but really only valued her destructive capability. He showed her all the deaths she'd caused, all the pain inflicted even when she tried to help, all the ways her power had isolated her from normal human experience. He wanted her to hate herself, to see herself as he saw himself, as fundamentally separate from humanity and therefore free to treat humans as toys or food. But 11 rejected this framing completely. Yes, she had power. Yes, people had tried to weaponize her. Brenner most explicitly, but others more subtly. Anyone who'd asked her to use her abilities to solve problems they couldn't solve themselves, but her choices defined her identity, not others' intentions for her or the circumstances of her creation. She'd chosen to protect people. She'd chosen love over hate, connection over isolation, hope over despair. Where Henry had found comfort in darkness, 11 had found it in friendship and family. That difference would determine the battle's outcome. The external battle raged simultaneously, the physical component of a fight that was primarily spiritual and psychic. The Mind Flayer's castle came alive in response to the assault. Walls becoming tentacles that grabbed at the heroes, floors opening into mouths lined with teeth that shouldn't exist, the entire structure fighting to destroy the intruders who dared challenge its host. The visual effects showcased a Lovecraftian nightmare, organic and mechanical systems merged into something that hurt to look at directly, that violated instinctive expectations about how matter should behave. The gang fought desperately against impossible odds, combining conventional weapons with psychic abilities with sheer desperate courage, born from having nothing left to lose. Nancy's death seemed imminent at several points during the battle. Demogorgon claws inches from her throat, tentacles wrapped around her legs, pulling her toward consuming darkness, only for last-second saves to snatch her back from oblivion. Steve fulfilled his protector role repeatedly, throwing himself between danger and those he'd sworn to protect, taking hits meant for others, accepting pain to spare them. Jonathan captured moments of the battle through his camera lens even while fighting, documenting everything that happened in case none of them survived to tell the story. His photographs would provide evidence that even skeptics couldn't dismiss, proof that the supernatural invasion had happened, testimony for a world that still wanted to pretend Hawkins was just an unlucky town rather than a battlefield in a war most people didn't know was being fought. Dustin's encyclopedic knowledge of Dungeons and Dragons became tactically relevant in ways that justified years of gameplay. He recognized the Mind Flayer's castle structure as analogous to the Thessal Hydra, a multi-headed dragon from their early campaigns. This recognition allowed him to predict attack patterns, identify weak points in the castle's defences, guide the team's efforts toward maximum effectiveness. What had seemed like useless trivia, obsessive focus on fantasy games, while the world demanded practical skills, became mission-critical intelligence in the moment when it mattered most. Hopper's military training, combined with his experience surviving the Russian prison, provided crucial leadership during moments when the battle threatened to spiral into chaos. He kept people focused on objectives, prevented panic from turning into rout, made hard calls about risk allocation and acceptable casualties. But when Vecna created a vision showing Sarah on her deathbed, projected directly into Hopper's mind, his composure cracked in ways that terrified everyone who depended on his strength. The vision showed Sarah in the hospital bed, where she died years ago, looking exactly as Hopper remembered from those final terrible days. She asked why he'd let her die, why he hadn't saved her, why he'd failed as a father when she needed him most. Hopper knew intellectually that these were lies, that Sarah's death from childhood leukemia hadn't been his fault, that love and willpower couldn't cure cancer. But knowing something intellectually doesn't make it hurt less emotionally. The vision devastated him, and in that moment of vulnerability, Hopper made a mistake. that would have lasting consequences. He fired his weapon at what he thought was a threat, but was actually a containment tank, accidentally releasing toxic gas that forced the team to retreat from an advantageous position. Believing he killed 11 in the chaos and confusion that followed, Hopper's grief temporarily paralysed the team's coordination. People shouted for orders, and he couldn't respond, frozen by the prospect of having failed to protect another daughter, of having caused her death through his own actions rather than being helplessly unable to prevent it. They recovered after precious moments, discovered 11 was alive, and had been shielded by Callie's illusion powers, but the emotional impact remained. Hopper confronted the possibility of losing a second daughter, and the conversation that followed between him and 11 cut to the heart of their relationship and the season's themes about sacrifice and choice. 11 insisted she wasn't a replacement for Sarah, that her choices were her own, that Hopper had to let her make those choices even if they led to her death. She'd thought about this conversation, prepared what she wanted to say, knowing they'd eventually have to address the tension between Hopper's need to protect and her need for autonomy. She loved him as a father, valued everything he'd done for her, but she couldn't let his trauma dictate her choices. She had to be her own person, even if being her own person meant dying for a cause she believed in. Hopper argued that he'd already lost one daughter and couldn't bear losing another, that asking him to accept 11's potential sacrifice was asking more than any parent should have to give. They found middle ground, not in agreement about the right course of action, but in understanding each other's perspectives, and accepting that they came from love rather than selfishness or inability to see the other person clearly. Hopper accepted that he couldn't protect 11 from everything, that trying to do so would damage their relationship and ultimately fail, because 11 was too strong-willed to be controlled. 11 acknowledged that Hopper's fear came from love, not from dismissing her as a child, and that she could give him the respect of considering his feelings even while ultimately making her own choices. The military intervention complicated everything at the worst possible moment. Dr. Kane's forces arrived during the climactic battle, breaching the Upside Down through their own methods, pursuing objectives that sometimes aligned with and sometimes opposed the group's goals. She wanted to capture 11 for study and weaponization, wanted specimens from the Upside Down for weapons development programs, wanted to prove that supernatural threats could be controlled through superior technology and firepower. Akery's Wolfpack team cornered Callie during a moment when she was separated from the others, exhausted from maintaining illusions that protected the group from Vecna's perception. In the standoff that followed, Akery demanded her surrender, promised she'd be treated well if she cooperated, threatened violence if she resisted. Callie, who'd spent her entire life being used by people who promised cooperation would benefit her, chose resistance. Akery shot her, and her death seemed certain. Indeed, she did die in a literal sense, her body falling, blood spreading across the corrupted ground of the Upside Down. But Callie's illusion powers meant that death itself could be ambiguous, that what appeared to be her corpse might be an elaborate illusion while her real body escaped. The question of whether Callie truly died or created an illusion of death to facilitate escape remained unresolved through the finale, the show deliberately refusing to clarify. Murray's heroic intervention, saving 11 and Hopper from military capture by disabling Kane's command vehicle, created enough chaos for what might have been Callie's body to disappear. Did she escape into the Upside Down's deeper regions, finding refuge in dark spaces even Vecna didn't fully control? Did she die and let her final illusion create the possibility of survival, giving her allies hope even if it was false? The show respected both interpretations, allowed viewers to choose based on their own relationship to hope and narrative closure. 11's decision to remain in the Upside Down to close the bridge came as both surprise and inevitability. She'd known from the planning stages that stopping Vecna and severing the connection to Dimension X might require ultimate sacrifice. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Someone with her specific psychic abilities needed to stay on the Upside Down side of the bridge while it was destroyed, using their power to seal the dimensional rupture from within. The explosion that would destroy the bridge would likely kill anyone in the blast radius. She could have told the others earlier, could have given them time to argue and plan alternatives, but she'd chosen not to because she knew they'd try to stop her or find another way. Sometimes the hardest part of making a sacrifice wasn't the sacrifice itself, but accepting that the people you loved couldn't save you from it. So she'd kept her intention private, shared it only with Callie, who'd helped create contingency illusions in case Eleven needed to hide her true plans from the group. Mike's anguish at this decision provided the emotional core of the finale's climax, his heartbreak at realising what Eleven intended devastating to watch. He'd fought alongside her through everything, believed in her when others dismissed her as dangerous or broken, loved her with the intensity that only first love possesses. He'd dreamed of a future where they could be normal together, go to movies and hold hands, argue about trivial things instead of life and death matters, grow old surrounded by the family they'd build. Now she was telling him that future wouldn't happen, that she'd chosen the world over their relationship, that his belief in happy endings might have been naive fantasy all along. Their final conversation invoked the waterfalls Mike had mentioned earlier in the season, beautiful places where Eleven could find peace after everything ended. He'd imagined taking her there, watching her experience natural beauty without fear or responsibility, just existing in the moment. The promise of waterfalls became a metaphor for the life Eleven wanted but couldn't have, the normal existence always dangling just out of reach. She could see it, imagine it, but circumstances kept pulling her back to duty and sacrifice. The montage of their relationship's best moments, set to Purple Rain, functioned as both tribute and eulogy, celebrating what they'd shared while acknowledging it was ending. The final battle against Vecna himself combined psychic warfare with physical combat, Eleven and Will working in concert, after Will pushed past the Mind Flayer's attempts to control him. Their mental powers complemented each other in unexpected ways. Eleven's strength enhanced by Will's sensitivity, creating harmonies in their abilities that multiplied their effectiveness. They weren't just fighting alongside each other. They were fighting as a single consciousness divided between two bodies. Henry found himself impaled on psychic constructs that Eleven and Will created together. The disciples' mental hold broken by the demonstration that love and friendship could generate power equal to what corruption and domination produced. The Mind Flayer's bridge began burning, dimensional energy destabilizing, the carefully maintained connection to Dimension X collapsing under the assault. The gang attacked the castle's exterior while Eleven fought Vecna's consciousness internally, a coordinated assault on multiple fronts that Vecna couldn't defend against simultaneously. The power of friendship, which could have felt trite if poorly executed, instead felt earned after 5 seasons of developing these relationships. These characters had fought together across years and seasons, had saved each other's lives repeatedly, had chosen each other over and over when easier paths presented themselves. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses intimately. They coordinated instinctively, protecting each other, covering gaps in each other's defences, functioning as a unit forged through shared trauma and triumph. Steve knew without being told when Nancy needed covering fire. Dustin anticipated where Lucas would move before Lucas moved there. Jonathan's photographs provided intelligence about enemy positions that the others incorporated into their tactics without discussion. Joyce delivered the final blow to Vecna's physical form, beheading him slowly and deliberately in a moment of grim justice. The imagery evoked execution, righteous judgment delivered after long pursuit of a criminal who'd escaped accountability for too long, but even in death, Vecna remained ambiguous as a character. Was Henry Creel finally free from the Mind Flayer's influence in those last moments? Did some part of him welcome death as release from years of possession and corruption? Or was he evil to the core, undeserving of sympathy even in his final moments? The show declined to answer definitively, instead choosing to show the other psychic children, the ones who hadn't taken Henry's path despite similar circumstances and abilities. They'd chosen connection over isolation, love over hate, community over power, and that choice had saved them from Vecna's fate. The message was clear without being heavy-handed. Circumstances don't determine outcome. Choice matters. Agency matters. Even in the darkest situations, facing the most terrible temptations, The possibility of choosing light over darkness remains. The explosion that destroyed the bridge seemed to claim Eleven's life, consuming her in dimensional fire that burned across multiple realities simultaneously. The team escaped the Upside Down through the breach before it sealed completely, running desperately as the castle collapsed behind them, the gateway closing behind them with finality. But 11 remained on the other side, trapped in the Upside Down or consumed by the explosion. Her sacrifice appeared complete and final. The montage showing her and Mike's relationship moments played as memorial, acknowledging what was lost in service of what was saved. Their first meeting in the woods, soaking wet and terrified, Mike offering his jacket. Their first kiss, awkward and sweet. Dancing at the snowball, looking at each other like nothing else existed, fighting side by side against demogorgons and mind flayers, and all the horrors the Upside Down had thrown at them. Building a relationship that shouldn't have worked, but did. Two people from different worlds finding each other. But the finale's epilogue, set 18 months later, introduced ambiguity about Eleven's fate that gave viewers permission to hope. Mike refused to believe she was dead, constructing theories about how she might have escaped at the last moment using abilities they didn't fully understand. He talked about Callie's illusions, about the possibility that what they saw wasn't what actually happened, about 11 being resourceful enough to find a way out that no one anticipated. These theories could be dismissed as denial, a grieving boyfriend unable to accept loss, creating elaborate fantasies rather than facing reality. The other characters treated Mike's theories gently, with the careful kindness people show when someone they love is hurting, but nothing they say will help. All Mike's theories could be correct, validated by 11's formidable abilities and demonstrated capacity for survival against impossible odds, supported by Callie's existence proving that psychic powers could create convincing illusions of death. The show presented both interpretations as valid, giving equal weight to the possibility that 11 was dead and the possibility that she'd survived. The optimistic reading, which Mike championed, saw 11 living peacefully somewhere remote, having earned her rest through ultimate sacrifice, letting everyone believe she was dead so they wouldn't search for her or try to bring her back into the fight. The realistic reading acknowledged that she died saving the world, making the choice she'd known from the beginning might be necessary, giving her life meaning through how it ended. The finale refused to explicitly confirm either interpretation, instead letting viewers choose based on their own relationship to hope and closure, their own beliefs about whether the universe rewards sacrifice or simply takes what it can get. This ambiguity frustrated some viewers who wanted definitive answers, but satisfied others who appreciated the thematic resonance of leaving 11's fate as uncertain as the future always is. The flash-forward showed Hawkins rebuilding from the damage sustained across multiple seasons of supernatural invasion. The curse had lifted when the bridge to Dimension X was destroyed. The Upside Down's influence was gone, no more gates opening unexpectedly, no more monsters appearing in quiet neighbourhoods, no more children disappearing into nightmare dimensions. The town could finally heal, though the scars would remain forever. Steve taught high school, finding fulfillment in shaping young minds and being the kind of adult mentor he'd wished he'd had during his own difficult teenage years. Jonathan attended film school in California, pursuing artistic passions he'd suppressed while focusing on family obligations and survival. Nancy worked at the Hawkins Herald, still chasing truth through journalism, but now with the credibility and authority her earlier work had earned her. She'd become the paper's lead investigative reporter, trusted to handle the most sensitive stories. The characters had moved forward with their lives, carrying their trauma but not consumed by it, changed by everything they'd experienced but not broken beyond repair. They'd learned to live in the aftermath of impossible things, to build normal lives on foundations that included fighting monsters and travelling to other dimensions. Their resilience spoke to the human capacity for adaptation and healing. The graduation ceremony provided closure for several character arcs, marking the transition from adolescence to adulthood for the younger group members. Mike's reluctance to walk the stage reflected his inability to move past 11's absence, his feeling that celebrating his own achievements while she was gone would somehow diminish her sacrifice or prove he hadn't loved her enough. Hopper's intervention, drawing on His own extensive experience with grief and loss gave Mike permission to continue living despite his pain. Hopper talked about Sarah, about how he'd frozen for years after her death, unable to move forward because moving forward felt like leaving her behind. But eventually he'd realised that Sarah would have wanted him to live, that honouring her memory meant building a life that reflected what she'd valued rather than becoming a monument to grief. Mike needed to hear this from someone who understood, someone who'd walked the path he was walking. Hopper urged him to fight through the paralysis, to honour Eleven's sacrifice by building a meaningful life rather than being frozen in mourning. The conversation gave Mike what he needed to participate in graduation, to take that symbolic step forward even while carrying the weight of loss. Dustin's speech at graduation, revealing the Hellfire Club shirt beneath his gown, celebrated the ways Dungeons and Dragons and outsider culture had shaped their lives and friendships. He talked about Eddie Munson without naming him at first, describing someone who taught him that being yourself, even when society judged you for it, was the bravest thing you could do. The crowd didn't understand at first, confused about why the valedictorian was talking about games and metal music instead of conventional achievement. Then Dustin ripped off his gown to show Eddie's Hellfire Club shirt, and the auditorium erupted in applause from everyone who'd known Eddie or been touched by his story. The message was clear. Those we lose remain with us through the impact they had on our lives, the ways they changed us for the better, the communities they helped build. Eddie lived on in Dustin and everyone else who'd learned from his example. The rooftop scene with the older kids acknowledged that relationships evolve, but don't necessarily end when people's paths diverge. Nancy's new job would take her to Indianapolis for training, then potentially to larger markets. If she pursued the career opportunities opening for her, Steve would be staying in Hawkins, committed to teaching and to the community that had shaped him. Jonathan's film school was across the country in Los Angeles. They promised to meet monthly to maintain the connections they'd forged through shared trauma and triumph. The promise was sincere, made with genuine intention, but the audience understood what the characters didn't quite admit yet. That life would get in the way, that monthly meetings would become quarterly, then yearly, then just staying in touch through occasional calls and messages. They'd always matter to each other, but the intensity of their friendship would inevitably fade as new experiences and relationships filled their lives. Nancy's revelation about turning down both Steve and Jonathan romantically, choosing to focus on her career rather than romance, represented personal growth and self-knowledge. She cared about both of them, but she'd realised that her primary relationship was with her work, her calling to expose truth and fight injustice. Maybe someday she'd want romantic partnership, but for now she needed space to become who she was meant to be without compromise. Joyce and Hopper's engagement, proposed over a simple dinner at home, captured the way their relationship worked. No grand gestures or public displays, just two damaged people who'd found each other and decided to commit formally to something they'd already been building for years. Their love was practical, built on shared understanding and mutual support, the kind that lasts because it's grounded in reality rather than fantasy. The final Dungeons and Dragons game brought the series full circle, creating symmetry with the opening scene of Season 1. The Duffer Brothers had said their favourite scene from the entire show was that first campaign, Mike and the boys playing in the basement, while Joyce searched desperately for Will, unaware that their game was about to become terrifyingly real. Ending with another game suggested that the essence of Stranger Things had always been about storytelling, imagination, and the power of shared narrative to create meaning and connection. Max's question about the game's neat resolution, her skepticism about everything wrapping up perfectly, spoke to broader questions about storytelling and life that the season had been exploring. Do we get happy endings in reality? Can things wrap up satisfactorily, or does life just continue with loose ends and unresolved questions? Mike's insistence that happy endings are possible, that you can choose hope even when darkness seems overwhelming, encapsulated the show's ultimate message. He acknowledged that bad things happen, that people suffer and die, that the universe doesn't guarantee justice or fairness. But he argued that cynicism and optimism both have evidence supporting them, that choosing between them reflects internal commitment rather than external reality. You can choose to believe in happy endings, to work toward them, to find meaning in struggle even when outcomes remain uncertain. That choice, repeated across days and years, shapes who you become and how you experience life. Will's story concluded with him meeting someone named Derek, who might become a romantic partner, finally finding acceptance and the possibility of love, beyond the group that had sustained him through everything. The scene was understated, just Will and Derek talking after the D&D game, discovering shared interests and feeling the spark of potential connection. The show's handling of Will's sexuality across the final season felt natural and earned, a thread woven throughout the series that reached satisfying resolution without melodrama or forced significance. Mike's continued belief in Eleven's survival, his role as storyteller, keeping her memory alive while also imagining her future, created the ambiguity that enriched rather than frustrated. He told the new players about the mage character who'd made the ultimate sacrifice, then added his theory about how she might have actually survived, might be out there somewhere living the peaceful life she'd earned. The new kids arriving to play Dungeons & Dragons suggested continuity, that Hawkins would continue, that new stories would be told even as old ones concluded. Mike had become the dungeon master, taking Will's old role, guiding new players through adventures that echoed their real experiences while remaining safely in the realm of imagination. The cycle continued, each generation facing their own monsters and finding their own courage. The credits sequence showed sketches and drawings of events from the season, the art style suggesting someone had illustrated the adventure like a graphic novel or campaign diary. This raised the metatextual possibility that everything had been a Dungeons & Dragons campaign, that the supernatural invasion had been imaginary all along, kids processing real trauma and adolescent challenges through fantasy narrative. This interpretation, neither confirmed nor denied by the show, allowed viewers to choose their level of engagement with the narrative's reality. Was it all a game these kids played? Their way of coping with normal but difficult experiences like grief and social isolation and growing up? Or was the game a frame through which they processed real trauma and genuine supernatural encounters, finding metaphors and meaning in fantasy that helped them understand impossible experiences? The Duffer Brothers confirmed in interviews that this was truly the end for these characters, that the planned spin-off would feature new characters, in new locations telling new stories within the same universe. This freed the finale from the obligation to leave hooks for future seasons, while also preserving the mystery of what happened to characters whose fates remained ambiguous like Eleven and Callie. Evaluating the season as a whole requires acknowledging both its considerable achievements and its limitations. The production values reached heights rarely seen in television, with visual effects and production design creating the Upside Down and Vecna's castle as fully realised environments that felt genuinely alien and hostile. The performances, particularly from the young actors who'd grown up across the show's run, demonstrated genuine skill and emotional depth that elevated material that could have felt melodramatic in less capable hands. The thematic exploration of growing up, of choosing light in the face of darkness, of the power and limitations of love and friendship, against cosmic evil, all resonated with emotional truth the series had cultivated from its beginning. The show understood that the real story was never about defeating monsters, but about how fighting monsters changed the fighters, about maintaining humanity and connection when circumstances pushed toward isolation and despair. But the season also struggled with overcrowded character rosters and plot lines that sometimes felt underdeveloped relative to the screen time they consumed. The split release strategy created pacing issues, with Volume 2 in particular feeling more like setup than satisfying narrative in its own right. Waiting a month between volumes to basically just get preparation for the finale frustrated many viewers who felt the story could have been structured more efficiently. Some character arcs received less attention than they deserved, casualties of trying to service too many perspectives and storylines in limited screen time. Nancy's journalism, Jonathan's photography, Steve's journey toward teaching. All of these could have been developed more fully if the show had fewer characters competing for focus. The ensemble cast was one of Stranger Things' strengths, but it also meant that not everyone got the depth of development that dedicated fans wanted for their favourite characters. The Vecna-Mind Flayer relationship remained somewhat muddled, despite the season's attempts to clarify it. The revelation that the Mind Flayer had been the true power behind everything could have been developed more clearly through dialogue and visual storytelling. The ambiguity about whether Henry retained agency or was purely the Mind Flayer's puppet affected emotional investment in his character, made it harder to know how to feel about his defeat and death. A clearer statement about their relationship might have strengthened the finale's emotional impact. If Henry was purely a victim, possessed from childhood, and never truly responsible for his actions, then his death was tragedy. If he was evil independent of the Mind Flayer, choosing darkness freely, then his death was justice. The show tried to have it both ways, suggesting both interpretations were partially true, but that ambiguity made it harder to achieve catharsis. The limited death toll surprised viewers who'd expected major character deaths based on the Duffer Brothers. Comments about the season being dark and having real consequences. While the show's fundamentally hopeful tone made sense as a reason to spare most characters, it also reduced stakes in some viewers' perceptions. When characters repeatedly escaped seemingly certain death, the tension diminished because audiences learned to expect last-second saves. The show valued emotional truth and character closure over shocking plot developments, which was a defensible creative choice but not one that satisfied everyone. Some viewers wanted more brutal consequences, more permanent losses, feeling that the stakes of fighting cosmic evil should include more tragedy. Others appreciated that the show stayed true to its optimistic core message even in the final season. The themes around sacrifice and choice worked better than the themes around cosmic horror. The Mind Flayer never quite achieved the terrifying inevitability of truly great cosmic horror entities from Lovecraft or similar authors. It remained beatable, which was necessary for the story to have a satisfying conclusion, but reduced its power as metaphor for incomprehensible evil beyond human understanding. True cosmic horror involves facing things that can't be defeated, only temporarily escaped or survived, and Stranger Things ultimately wasn't willing to embrace that level of bleakness. The finale's ambiguity about Eleven's fate worked for some viewers and frustrated others in ways that split along personality lines regarding tolerance for uncertain endings. Those who wanted definitive closure, who needed to know for certain whether Eleven lived or died, found the open ending unsatisfying and somewhat manipulative. Those who appreciated thematic resonance over plot resolution found it perfectly calibrated, giving space for hope while acknowledging the reality of sacrifice. Neither response was wrong. They reflected different values in storytelling and different relationships to narrative closure. The show made a choice to prioritize emotional truth and thematic consistency over providing answers to every question, and that choice inevitably meant some portion of the audience would feel unsatisfied. The season succeeded most in its quiet moments between characters, the conversations and small gestures that revealed relationships and values. Hopper and Eleven's conversations about sacrifice and choice, struggling to balance his protective instincts with her need for autonomy. Mike and Will's mutual acceptance and deepened friendship, built on years of shared experiences and genuine care for each other. Steve and Jonathan's mature handling of their complicated history with Nancy, choosing friendship over romantic competition. Joyce and Hopper finally getting their moment of happiness before facing potential loss. Two people who'd suffered so much finding peace in each other. These character beats, grounded in the relationships the show had built over years, provided its emotional foundation and reminded viewers why they had invested in these characters' journeys. The action sequences, while visually impressive with excellent effects and choreography, sometimes felt obligatory rather than organic. Included because big-budget finale seasons require spectacle rather than because the story specifically needed them. The show's heart had never been in combat and spectacle. It was in friendships formed over Dungeons and Dragons campaigns, in kids on bikes fighting things adults wouldn't believe in the ways extraordinary circumstances revealed ordinary people's heroism and capacity for love. Season 5 wrestled with the challenge facing all long-running narratives, how to conclude satisfyingly while remaining true to what made the story work originally. It succeeded more often than it failed, delivering a finale that, while imperfect, honoured the journey and gave these characters endings that felt appropriate to their arcs, even if not everyone got the specific conclusion viewers might have hoped for. For a show that began with a child disappearing and friends searching for him against impossible odds, ending with those friends grown and scattered, but still connected, felt right. They'd fought cosmic evil and won, though victory cost more than they'd hoped. They'd paid prices for their triumph, but not ones that destroyed them completely. They'd grown up in ways both beautiful and tragic, carrying scars but not consumed by them, changed by their experiences, but not broken beyond repair. The lasting image of Stranger Things will likely be that first season's scrappy group of kids on their bikes. Mike and Dustin and Lucas and Will, bonded through shared imagination and the kind of intense friendships that feel like they'll last forever when you're young. The later seasons showed those friendships evolving, tested by time and trauma and the simple fact of growing up, but never quite breaking completely even when they bent under terrible pressure. That refusal to let cynicism win, that insistence that love and friendship and hope matter. Even against overwhelming darkness defined the series from beginning to end. Eleven's possible sacrifice, whether literal death or chosen disappearance, embodied that ethos. She gave everything to protect the people and world she loved, and in doing so proved that darkness doesn't have to win, that individual choice can matter even against cosmic forces that want to render us helpless and insignificant. The show asked us to believe in the power of connection, to see heroism in ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances, to understand that growing up doesn't mean abandoning imagination or wonder, and to hold on to hope even when the darkness seems overwhelming. Whether you found the finale fully satisfying or somewhat disappointing, those themes remained consistent, earning their resonance through 8 years of storytelling that genuinely cared about these characters and the world they inhabited. As the final credits rolled and we said goodbye to Hawkins, Indiana, the impression left behind was of a story that understood what it wanted to say and said it with passion and commitment. Not every element worked perfectly. Some plot threads dangled unresolved. Some characters deserved more screen time than they received. But the emotional core remained strong throughout. The thematic resonance earned through seasons of building toward this conclusion. For those of us who grew up alongside these characters, who watched kids become teenagers, become young adults, the ending marked more than just the conclusion of a television series. It marked the end of an era in our own lives, a reminder that nothing lasts forever, but the impact of meaningful stories and genuine connections persists long after the screen goes dark. Thank you for spending this time exploring Hawkins and Stranger Things' final chapter with me. If you found comfort in this exploration, if these long-form deep dives help you process complex narratives or simply provide peaceful background while you drift towards sleep, please consider subscribing to Quiet Theories. Your support makes these videos possible and helps this channel continue bringing you thoughtful analysis of the stories that captivate our collective imagination. May your own story, whatever challenges it holds, find moments of wonder, connection, and hope in the darkness. Sleep well, and thank you for being here.